Where did civilization begin? What we all learned in school growing up was civilization began in Mesopotamia, or in modern day Iraq, with the Sumerian civilization. Now, this was about 6,000 years ago, but we're going to take a look at something a little bit older. This is Graham Hancock. He's an author and journalist and even has a documentary on Netflix now, but he believes that an advanced society existed during the last ice age. He says that pieces of their knowledge were left behind in myths and ancient monuments. He says that this ancient society was wiped out by the Younger Dryas impact. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis states that around 12,800 years ago, fragments of a comet or asteroid struck the Earth, and this caused massive floods, wildfires, and a sudden return to glacial conditions. Hancock believes that this event wiped out the Ice Age civilization and left only scattered survivors who attempted to rebuild. He says that the survivors of the lost civilization spread their knowledge across the world, which influenced later societies like the Egyptians, the Sumerians, and even the Mayans. He suggests that some surviving members of the civilization may have been perceived as gods or wise sages by some of these societies. What does he say are some of the characteristics of this lost society? He suggests that they had knowledge of astronomy, engineering, and navigation. And as evidence for this, he points to sites such as Göbekli Tepe and the Great Sphinx. Pictured on the right is actually a pillar from Göbekli Tepe, and if you notice, the carving in the stone is not carved into the stone, it is carved around the stone, so it's coming out of it. Göbekli Tepe is a Neolithic site located in Turkey, and pictured on the right is just a small section of what is there, but it's just not like mainly the excavated part. And on the left, you can see how things are carved around the rock instead of into the rock. While mainstream archaeologists will tell you that Göbekli Tepe is nothing but a Stone Age religious site used by hunter-gatherers, Graham Hancock suggests that the construction of it reflects a level of astronomical and architectural knowledge that should not have been possible for people of that time, nonetheless hunter-gatherers. The site itself dates back to 9600 BC, and this places it at the end of the Younger Dryas period. A lot of the carvings in and around the site include animal motifs, and Hancock believes these were used as astronomical markers. Hancock suggests that these animals, or the site itself, are strategically placed so where they track celestial events, such as, or maybe predict would be a better word, such as the precession of the equinoxes. Hancock believes that Göbekli Tepe is the dawn of civilization, but it was built with knowledge that the people shouldn't have had for the time. In regards to the Great Sphinx, Hancock suggests that it's much older than what is commonly accepted. Egyptologists today will tell you that it was built around 2500 BC, but Hancock believes it's about 12,000 years old. One, or the main point of evidence that Hancock points out, is the erosion not only on the body of the Sphinx itself, but on the surrounding walls of its enclosure. And if you look in the picture, you can kind of see the lines there. It's obviously erosion lines, and Hancock says these are water erosion lines. And the last time there was enough water to erode that much was at the end of the last ice age, or 12,000 years ago. Hancock also points out that the Sphinx has an astronomical alignment. He notes that it faces the sun during the equinox, which he suggests is a deliberate design choice. And obviously, to do that, you would need a high degree of astronomical knowledge. Here is Hancock on what he has to think about early civilizations and societies and how this sort of points to a, a previous advanced society.
It's very odd that all around the world we have this sudden upsurge of civilization about 6,000 years ago, preceded by what seems like a natural evolutionary process that would lead to a civilization, and yet certain ideas being carried down and manifested and expressed in many of these different civilizations. I just find that whole idea very puzzling and very disturbing, especially when I look at this radical break that takes place in not just the human story, but the story of all life on Earth, which was the last great cataclysm that the Earth went through, which was the Younger Dryas event. It was an extinction level event. That's when all the great megafauna of the Ice Age went extinct. It's after that, it's after that event that we start seeing this what are taken to be the beginnings of the first gradual steps towards civilization. We come out of the Upper Paleolithic as it's defined, the old end of the Old Stone Age, and into the Neolithic. And that's when the wheels are supposedly set in motion to start civilization rolling. But what happened before that, and why did that suddenly happen then? And I can't help feeling, and I've felt this for a very long while, that there are major missing pieces in our story.
What does mainstream archaeology have to say about Hancock and his theories? They point the pretty obvious fact out that there is no direct evidence for a lost civilization. I mean, if we had a city or any type of excavation that we can dig up and say this is that lost civilization, then he would be proven correct. But there is none, and everything else is just and pretty much an alternate explanation for sites that we have today. Archaeologists also say that Hancock has misrepresented the site of Gobekli Tepe. He says it's evidence of a lost advanced civilization because of the megalithic architecture, but they just think it was a group of hunter gatherers and they were sort of transitioning into settled life. While the Younger Dryas period that Graham envisions was caused by a comet impact, which is called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, uh, some archaeologists, or a lot of mainstream archaeologists, will say that there is no direct link from a comet impact to a lost civilization. They think that while that would be a very like volatile change, that the transition from hunter gatherers to like an agricultural society was gradual, and this was not caused by an abrupt catastrophe. Another thing that Hancock does that mainstream archaeology does not agree with is he connects common myths across civilizations across the world. He says, like, for example, a great flood myth is common across many civilizations, and it seems that they all come from maybe a singular event in the past, whereas archaeologists will say these developed independently. The man pictured on the left is archaeologist Flint Dibble, who is a professor at Cardiff University and is also a face of mainstream archaeology who fights against pseudoscience. Dibble argues that Hancock distorts archaeological research and that he presents a false narrative that archaeology is not willing to change and is stuck in a dogma. However, Flint says that archaeology is constantly updating based upon new findings. Flint also points to the fact that Hancock doesn't engage with peer-reviewed research, and he just promotes things to the public and in his way of doing podcasts or writing a book or a documentary, which is admittedly unscientific. Dibble points to the fact that Hancock's lost civilization has no physical evidence at all. Dibble says that there should be tools or pottery, even buildings or roads present, but they're not. He even says that writing or inscriptions should be able to be found, but they're not. And even some more clear technological influence on later civilizations should be present, but it's really not. It's more of a vague impression of it. Pictured on the right is Zahi Hawass, who is one of the most foremost Egyptologists today, and he's the former minister of antiquities in Egypt. And he's been a strong critic of Graham Hancock and his theories, particularly regarding his area of expertise, which is, of course, the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx. Hawass dismisses Hancock's claims and he calls them pseudo-archaeology. And he tries to say that, or he does say that Hancock ignores actual research, and he says that he twists facts to fit Hancock's narrative of a lost civilization. Hawass does not agree with Hancock's idea that the Sphinx is 12,000 plus years old. He believes that it was built around 2500 BC by the pharaoh Khafre, and he suggests that the erosion patterns we looked at earlier are not from water, but can be explained by wind over thousands of years. Hawass also says that Hancock is putting down Egyptian achievements by suggesting that someone else other than them had erected these obviously great monuments. Although, notably, Flint Dibble did agree to debate Hancock, whereas Hawass was supposed to debate Hancock, and he reportedly stormed out of the event and refused to engage with him. Some concepts from Novella's book that fit the spreading of this particular theory is cherry picking data, an argument from ignorance, and echo chambers. Hancock cherry picks data, in particular with the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, because not all scientists really believe that a comet hit the Earth, and there's no real evidence that it caused a mass extinction of human societies, but that idea, of course, fits his narrative of his lost civilization. He also cherry picks from the site of Göbekli Tepe, as there's no evidence in the site of, say, writing or metal tools or even city infrastructure, which are all things that you would expect from an advanced civilization that supposedly had either taught the people who built it or built it themselves. Hancock makes an argument from ignorance when he claims that the lack of written records from his supposed Ice Age civilization doesn't disprove its existence. But archaeologists will say that the absence of evidence is important, because if his civilization did exist, then they would expect to find evidence of that in form of artifacts, tools, inscriptions of some kind, or even a city ruin. And in response to this, Hancock says that just because we haven't found it yet doesn't mean it didn't exist, which some say shifts the burden of proof unfairly. Although, notably, even the Sumerian civilization was a quote lost civilization that wasn't found until the late 19th century. And the Hancock does engage in echo chambers a lot, admittedly. He doesn't publish in academic journals, as mentioned earlier, where his ideas would be subjected to peer review. And he instead, in place of this, he writes books, appears on TV shows, even has his own TV show on Netflix, Ancient Apocalypse. You should check it out. And podcasts, where he controls the narrative most of the time. This mostly allows him to avoid critical feedback from professional archaeologists, which isn't always true, because he did debate Flint Dibble on a podcast, and he does get a bunch of feedback from mainstream archaeology. But for the most part, it is true. Lastly, Hancock commonly dismisses critics as closed-minded, and he frequently claims that mainstream archaeologists, they reject his ideas out of bias, and by portraying these experts as dogmatic and unwilling to consider new ideas, he encourages his audience to distrust professional archaeologists. This further strengthens his echo chamber by encouraging his followers to not really listen to people who do the scientific work.